Hey there everybody, welcome to the 1:30 Soil Science panel called Creating a Thriving Rhizosphere. So this is for all you soil nerds in the room. Welcome. I am Shango Los, moderator for the panel and host of the Shaping Fire podcast. If you enjoy learning from the top minds in the cannabis business industry, I encourage you to visit shapingfire.com to enjoy in-depth interviews on cannabis business, health, and technique that will provide you with actionable information and not waste your time. Also, our YouTube channel serves over 500,000 minutes of exclusive cannabis content a month that I've gathered from conferences just like this one and from traveling the country to visit industry experts. As a matter of fact, if you dig the panel today, it will be on the Shaping Fire YouTube channel next week. Other recent guests have included cultivator Kevin Jodry, the godfather of cannabis terpenes neurologist Dr. Ethan Russo, geneticist Dr. Reggie Gaudino on cannabis plant patents, and Colin Bell and Tad Hussey from our panel today. Natasha Riz on using the cannabis root ball as medicine, and many other folks. So it's a lot of good stuff. So if you've got your mobile phone with you, and we know you do, please take a moment and put it on vibrate so we don't have to hear it. Immediately to my right is Colin Bell. Colin Bell is the co-founder of Mammoth Microbes and co-inventor of their flagship product, Mammoth P. He received his PhD in biological sciences, specializing in soil microbial ecology and plant microbe interactions. To his right is Dr. Jade Stefano. Jade Stefano is co-founder and CEO of Puffin Farm. She earned her biology degree at Reed College and a doctorate in naturopathic medicine from Bastyr University in 2016. And to her right is Tad Hussey. Tad Hussey is owner of KIS Organics. He earned a master's from Macquarie University, Australia in 2005, but received the bulk of his soil education in the family business over in Redmond, Washington. Tad manages the research and microscope testing for KIS Organics and teaches soil and botany courses at the KIS Farms. He is the co-founder of logicalgardener.org, a free science-based horticulture forum that has formulated soils, nutrients, and other products over the past decade. Tad is also host of the Cannabis Cultivation and Soil Science podcast. So if you're a soil nerd and you haven't checked out Tad's podcast, I highly recommend it. It goes deep into vocabulary that loses people, which is usually a good sign. All right, so today we're going to be talking about creating a thriving rhizosphere. And for people who may be new to soil science, that's the area that lives all around the root structure. So it's the neighborhood of the root. So we're going to be talking about the life that happens below the soil near the root. So we're going to start with a question for Colin first, and then Jade and Tad will take a turn with the question as well. So here we go. So Colin, for a generation, most cannabis growers have simply followed directions on the back of bottled nutrients and hoped everything was okay in the soil. Now, though, we understand that having a thriving rhizosphere is essential to great tasting terpene profiles and sustainable results for business. What does it mean to you to have a thriving rhizosphere, and what are some of the outcomes you would expect to see in the soil from your cannabis crop when you actually do create a thriving rhizosphere?
Yeah, thanks very much, Shango. And for me, this has been a really fun journey because I am approaching cannabis cultivation from my academic or fundamental science background, where I was a soil microbial ecologist, and for years and years, my studies and my publications focused on understanding how microbes interact with plants to support plant health, plant development in natural systems, and in agriculture systems. And so when thinking about how to apply microbes, or what I think about rhizosphere health in more precision agriculture indoor practices, it all relates to the biology. The rhizosphere is the root zone, and microbes thrive in the root zone, and there's a really significant interaction that occurs where plants will feed the microbes from the carbon they assimilate through the air and squirt in as simple sugars to stimulate the microbial community or rhizosphere microbial community. They do that because they get an exchange. When you get a density and the right diversity of microbes, when plants do in the rhizosphere, they get exchanges with nutrient uptake, with protecting the rhizosphere from other potential pathogens. And what I think we see data-driven when we add more biology into what might be a relatively sterile salt environment, we see the plants respond by increasing their yield and increasing their quality. And I attribute that mostly to the not only increased absorption potential that plants can take nutrients up that might not be available through those microbial interactions and assert them or allocate them towards more yield and towards more quality metrics. But some nutrients and micronutrients become limiting very quick because of absorption capacity within the rhizosphere or substrate zone. And microbes, as they do in nature, will liberate those micronutrients and allow plants to take them up. Those micronutrients in particular act as catalysts or as cofactors to allow plants to maximize their physiology, which allows plants to increase yield significantly and quality. What we see in our studies, and I'll end it there, is when we engage with commercial farmers and on our trial farm, we have cannabis and high CBD cannabis farms in Colorado, strictly for R&D purposes. Not only do we see increases in yield, but we see significant increases in different terpene profiles and different cannabinoid profiles, which strongly relates to the plant microbe interaction. Different microbes will help plants in different ways take up those resources to allocate towards those qualities.
Right on, thanks, Colin. So Jade, what do you look for to know in your soil or in your crop that the rhizosphere is healthy?
Yeah, so when we first started growing indoors in the early 90s, we tried all different methods. We grew in pots, we grew hydroponically, we used soil, chemical fertilizers, organic fertilizers, fish emulsions, backwanos, all types of things. And by the end of this journey, I mean, we started growing in the 90s and we were doing it through the early 2000s. We, at some point, realized that cannabis grown in soil always tastes better. And at that point, we didn't really have the science to tell us why, but it was just visible through experimentation. And so we started growing exclusively in soil at that point. And now that all the science is coming out, we know that there is this microbial community that is making nutrients available and letting the plants get optimal health. So they do express better terpene and cannabinoid profiles. And it's just really interesting because I think people have known for years that soil cannabis tasted better and they just didn't know why. And so now we have the evidence, which is pretty cool. And so when we started growing in 502, we decided to grow outdoors in a living farm in the soil that is native to the earth, and so we had to amend the soil. It was an old hay farm that had been cultivated intensively. They did not use fertilizers or pesticides. It was just hay year after year, kind of sucking the life out of the sandy loam soil that we were blessed with. And so by the time we got it, it was a really good base of sandy loam, but it had been stripped of a lot of the organic matter, and the microbial community was not so great. And so we have been working over the last 5 years to rebuild that. And so, and that's been, every year we see an improvement in the soil, and it's been a really interesting journey. But definitely soil is always, it provides the medium for the microbes, and then adding things to the soil. So we have added a lot of biochar, which is really important. That is a permanent amendment that you put in the soil, and it will be there for 1,000 years or more. It'll be there forever. It's inorganic carbon, so it doesn't break down the way organic carbon does, and it provides habitat for all these microbial communities that we're talking about. So as far as an actionable item in building farm soil, biochar is our absolute favorite, one of our favorites. And yeah.
Right. Thank you. Ted.
You guys touched on a lot of things. Going back to what Colin hit on though, a little bit around nutrient cycling. From a layman's perspective, this idea when we're adding organic nutrients to the soil, what we're really doing is we're feeding all of these microbial communities in the rhizosphere and then cycling the nutrients and making the plant available. So when we add fish meal or alfalfa meal, we're not directly feeding the plant. And that's, I think, really important. But what we're finding even from working with giant pumpkin growers, for instance, they sort of peaked out from seed to fruit around 1,000 pounds, 1,200 pounds, which is pretty amazing. But since they started reincorporating back in biological things like mycorrhizal fungus and various organic amendments and taking more care with the compost and looking at the biology, they were able to up the yields, and through improved genetics, now they're up in, I think, 2,400 pounds. So it's sort of, there's definitely a synergy going on in the Rhizosphere that I think is really important. And then Jade touched on biochar. And as someone who has worked with some different biochar producers, I just want to comment that not all biochar is the same, and it's really important to know what you're purchasing and what you're applying, because biochar is sort of this catch-all term. But if you get high-quality biochar, I would say we're seeing about 8 to 9% better growth in yield just with the addition of biochar. So it is a wonderful thing.
Right, cool. Thank you, Tad. So for question 2, we're going to start with Jade, and then go to Tad, and then Colin. So Dr. Stefano, at commercial scale, producers are working with large volumes of soil, and they often need more scalable solutions than we use as home growers. They may be using local soils or importing soils to grow in large bags. Either way, these soils may not be in the best condition for growing vibrant plants. What can you suggest for commercial scale growers to invigorate and revitalize the soil they are beginning to put to work?
Yeah, so, and that's kind of what our situation was. So cover crops are a really great thing, and that is something that there's all different types of cover crops. Nitrogen fixing ones are especially beneficial to reinvigorate the soil. They put out roots that help the texture of the soil and break up compact soil, and they also fix nitrogen from the atmosphere and release that into the soil, and when they die, they are turned into additional organic material and nitrogen that the plants can feed off of. So a long-term solution is using cover crops in your aisles and then in between plantings. So off-season in the fall, you plant a cover crop, and that will keep growing into the spring, and then it may or may not be tilled in depending on whether you're doing a no-till or a till scenario. Other things that we really like that are economical at scale are alfalfa meal. That's pretty cheap input material. It's got compounds in it that microbes absolutely love, and it has some nitrogen. It's not very strong, but it adds a lot of organic matter. It provides great substrate for the microbes to feed on. Worm castings, that's another thing that it's a little bit more difficult at scale because they can be quite expensive, but there are some sources for affordable worm castings in bulk, and you don't need as much as you would think. And so even at relatively low concentrations, worm castings provide really great microbial activity, organic matter, phosphorus, all kinds of nutrients. And so that's another one we love. What else? We put in a lot of rock dust, and that's another cheap amendment. A lot of soils are lacking in micronutrients, so putting in rock powders from different sources can provide a wide spectrum of base micronutrients. And those you need to handle very carefully. They are an inhalation hazard, and so when those are being used, proper precautions need to be taken. And mulching is a really great thing to do, and that can be done with like the cover crops that you grow, and then you can just mow those down right under the plants. And so we do not weed our farm anymore. We pretty much mulch the weeds in, we cut them down, we put a lot of cover crops. It's like choose your weeds. So we choose alfalfa and vetch, and well, not alfalfa, vetch and clovers and beneficial insect-attracting plants like calendula, and there's a whole bunch of them, radishes, daikons. And so these are grown around the plants, and when they start getting too big and encroaching on the plants, we mow them down, and they create a mulch right there under the plants, and that breaks down and keeps other weeds from growing up. And so thinking that you have to keep a bare soil under your plants or use black plastic to prevent weeds is kind of a little bit counterproductive in a lot of ways. I'm not a fan of that. So yeah.
Well, great. Thank you, Jade. Go ahead, Tad.
That was a pretty good answer. I don't really have a lot to add, other than I always suggest that people, if we're talking about outdoor farms, which seems to be the focus of this particular question, then I always suggest get to know your neighbors. Find out what cover crops they're using on their fields, because a lot of times they've done that research for you and they have that knowledge. Bringing in outside consultants like myself to come in and tell you what cover crop to run is not always the best idea. They'll know about the type of water and how your water may change over the course of the season too, which is really important. And then also find out what you can source locally. There's so many great amendments probably in your area. I know like in Ellensburg there's probably a lot of cow manure available. But finding things that are locally sourced is a really great option, and obviously evaluating the quality of that. So worm castings made from cow manure are going to be a very different quality than worm castings made from horse manure or green waste or other sources. So It's important to do a little more research on all this stuff and really know what you're putting on your soil, but there are a lot of good local resources. And then the last thing I would mention is on our farm, which is the vegetable farm, we use a lot of arborist chips. We get them for free. They need a place to dump the chips. And when we get deciduous chips, we take those and we save those for composting. And then all the hardwood chips that we get in, we use for pathways around the farm. And that does a great job of weed suppression where we know we really don't want weeds.
Yeah, again, everything's been covered pretty well, so I'm just going to kind of overview my perspective of this. And I'm going to start with the carbon. Carbon is the currency of all life on Earth, and it's the currency which provides the substrate and the fertility for plants to exist. Soil is a habitat, and it's the pool of nutrients that plants need to grow. The only element that plants get outside of soil is carbon, and they fix that from the air, from CO2, every other nutrient they get from the soil. So if you think about soil as a habitat and a pool of nutrients that are available for your plants to grow, that's the focus. And if you think about carbon as the currency of all life, that is the focus, because the carbon creates the habitat and the binding capacity and the fertility capacity for your soil to hold nutrients. It also creates the habitat for the microbes in that soil to cycle the nutrients, reflecting on what was shared in these past conversations, to deliver those nutrients to your plant. And so scaling carbon as we get to bigger farms is probably the challenge. We talked about mulch, we talked about biochar, we talked about cover crops, and there's costs and trade-offs associated with all those practices. I think as farms get larger, the cover crops become much more scalable. And what is a plant at the end of the day? We used to say this in academia from a microbiology lab. Plants are charismatic carbon pumps. They plant themselves in the ground, they take carbon from the air, and they suck it right down into the soil. So cover crops, if you can have seed and use cover crops effectively, you add carbon and habitat into your soils, which improves soil fertility and the capacity of nutritional value to be delivered back up to your plants.
Right on. Thank you, Colin. One thing I'm going to add too, as far as cover crops go, is if you think about it, one of the things that makes the Amazon so alive is that the canopy is holding the moisture in, and that's what we find from cover crops too, is because you've got this small area below the cover crop where you've got an Amazonian type canopy, and if the top of your soil is kept moist, all of the microbes and worms and all the other life can do their thing closer to the top of the soil where more of the cannabis roots are located. And so another advantage to that. And before we move on to the third question, I'm going to come back to you, Tad, because when I've heard you answer this question before, we usually get your plug for soil testing. And so I would like you to hit on the importance of soil testing, and then Jade and Colin, if you want to add on anything on soil testing, that would be great. But give that plug.
Sure. So when we talk about any soil or any nutrient program or any even microbial addition, what we have to look at is really we have to know what's already in the soil, because what we're trying to figure out is what the limiting factor of growth is. And if that's a nutrient, that's something we need to add. But randomly adding, a nutrient really doesn't solve the problem, and it can actually compound or create even more problems down the road. So it's really about balance, and that's sort of my pitch for soil testing. Is it is just another tool that you can use as a gardener, just like a rake or a shovel or anything else, to really know what's going on. And it's really I think the foundation that we want to build off of. And when we talk about microbial additions, what we're doing there is we're essentially unlocking or making those nutrients more available to the plant. So you sort of have two aspects. You have the test itself, which is going to tell you what you need to add in terms of nutrients, and then you have the microbes, which are going to give you the ability to cycle those nutrients into a form the plant can uptake.
Right. Thank you, Colin. Do either of you want to throw anything on top of that?
Yeah, so again, I think growing or cultivating or farming with data-driven decisions is critical. Variability happens. Farms, cultivation, cannabis farms alike are dynamic systems. They're always changing. And we have to inform that change with some form of data. And it's critical to start with a baseline of understanding what we're working with. As I mentioned, our substrate in the pot or our substrate as soil in the ground has an inherent soil nutrient holding capacity, which is going to change as your plants are taking up nutrients. In natural systems, those nutrients are recycled back down to the ground as detritus once the plants and the leaves fall, and so there's a natural cycle. In managed farms, in annual managed farms, often there's more nutrients leaving the soil than returning. And if you know what nutrient baseline you have at the beginning of every season, you can be very efficient and informed with what you put back in. And I think that's a really critical step that general agriculture, I'll just say, is missing significantly. There are soil tests, it's a common practice, but I know from years of research in agricultural sciences that more nutrients are put in than are ever taken up by plants, and nutrient buildup happen, and we have pretty good ecological pollution in waterways and buildup of phosphorus and nitrogen pollution, and those excessive chemicals, fertilizers that are added into the soil deplete or decrease microbial biodiversity, which decrease soil functionality. And so balancing out your nutrient inputs actually nurtures the potential of the life, the biology in your soil to persist and balance out the nutrient cycling potential so your plants can grow as naturally as possible in soils without having to amend a lot. We should be responsible, and knowing your microbial presence, the biodiversity, and the CFUs or the concentrations, along with those nutrient tests, allow you to have a baseline that you can follow over time. Farming, broad-scale farming, is about predictable variability, so you can be as consistent as possible. If you put a crop in, you want to have a predictable outcome year after year because you can manage predictability. And so that's what we're trying to do, and it goes all the way down to understanding the substrate of the soil.
Jade, do you have anything to add?
That's all good stuff, and I can't overemphasize how important soil testing is. We test every year, and we've actually seen our organic matter rate go up. It was 1% when we started. We're now at 5 or 6%. And so even we use a low till system, even with tilling, we see an increase. And we're putting back a lot of organic matter, and that's really important. And then when we add nutrients, we buy only what we need. We do the soil test, and so for some micro and macronutrients, and especially micronutrients like the limes and whatnot, some years we might need to add dolomite, other years we may not. And actually our soil doesn't need dolomite. We have a lot of natural magnesium in the soil, but different types of limes and just the basic amounts of the essential nutrients, you can calculate that and add fixed amounts and do that consistently every year, and then you're not adding too much, you're not adding too little, and you're just right, and it's adding stuff with a good reason and with science, and really important. Test your soil.
Can I touch on one more thing really quick, Shane? This will be fast. So this is a little bit of an aside, but I feel like soil gets a bad rap in a lot of ways because people, whenever they see a deficiency in a plant, they just assume it's a nutrient deficiency caused by the soil. And especially for indoor growers, you really have to look at your lighting, the quality of the lighting, the intensity of lighting, your CO2 levels, your temperature and humidity fluctuations, your hydrology, the way you're watering has a massive impact on nutrient availability. So don't just assume that your nutrient deficiency means you need to add CalMag or add something else. There's a lot more to it than that, and I would encourage people to look at a picture holistically. I get phone calls and people tell me, they send me a photo and say, fix this, and there's no way I could, no one could. You really have to know the whole picture to really understand what's going on. So that's really all I wanted to add on that.
All right, good. Well, don't put your microphone down because you're starting this next question. And so this is going to be our third and final question before we go to your questions. So if you're thinking you're going to have a question, now would be the time to determine what it's going to be. So this one we're going to start with you, Tad, and then we'll go to Colin, and then Jay will finish us up. So Tad, the cannabis plant Rhizosphere is an ever-changing place that has abundances and deficiencies over time. Other than soil testing, which we've already covered, for commercial farmers who need reliable and consistent results, how do you suggest the soil be managed over the scope of years to remain potent and abundant and not get depleted season after season?
You know, I really like Colin's answer to this. Realizing that in these commercial systems, every time we harvest the plant, we're pulling out nutrients and we're pulling out organic matter, and those things need to be replaced every cycle. And so by getting data points on that through soil testing, we're able to better manage over time our soil fertility, and by improving our soil fertility like Jade's been able to do, raising that organic matter 4% doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a huge improvement on a farm. And I think every year, I'm guessing their inputs are going down because of that. So creating not only a better soil fertility through mineral nutrient management, but also through biological management. That's where that organic matter and that carbon, creating that habitat is really important.
Yeah, that's really well said, and I think about it the same exact way. Sustainable agriculture is about giving more than you take away, and moderating your practices that accommodate that is what I would encourage. And that's about repeatability. And year after year, if you have pretty measurable or pretty consistent routines as far as how you're amending soil, and you collect the data on the responses or results of those practices, you can slightly alter and tweak your practices to match consistency. Consistency is key. Consistent practices equal consistent results, or manageable results that you can alter slightly to keep that trajectory. 4%, a 1% increase in organic matter in soils is a huge amount. It's incredible. A 5% doesn't happen very often. That means that there's a real drive in this farm to maximize carbon content, which is a direct correlation with soil health. So that's an amazing figure. Nice job.
Well, Jade, both of them are saying that your numbers are awesome. So why don't you close us out of this question with some actionable things that folks can do over the life of their farm to start to match your numbers?
And so we touched on some of these already, and cover cropping I think is enormous, and that's probably one of the fastest ways to put carbon back into the soil. Over years, every year you might get 1 or 2 cycles of tilling in plant matter that then adds to that organic material level in the soil. And so, I really like cover crops, you can tell, but and lots of compost. I mean, you can't really add too much compost. It's possible, but it would be very expensive to do so. And so just putting in as much compost as possible. Alfalfa, hays, you can mulch with those, and those are pretty cheap and add lots of carbon to the soil. And if you, when you start treating your soil well, stuff can turn around really quickly. Like I said, our farm, it was hay, they were tilling it, just planting hayseed and letting it grow, and just cutting hay for years and years, just sucking nutrients and carbon out of the soil. And once we started putting stuff back and adding compost and biochar, it turned around really quickly, and we were seeing, like I said, 1% a year increase, and it doesn't sound like a lot, but it is significant. And so we're getting up into those ideal 5% organic matter levels right now, and hopefully it'll keep growing, but we're pretty happy with where we're at.
Yeah.
Were you done? I wasn't getting this.
Yeah.
All right, great.
Yeah.
So before we go to question, let's do one quick speed round question, because one thing that I often hear after a panel like this are people are, I just can't afford all these amendments for the soil, right? And KNF is so hot right now, and a lot of the KNF ideals come from using natural materials found in your local area, hopefully even on your own farm, so you don't have to pay for it all. So, in 90 seconds or so, will you each hit on that idea of using local inputs or free inputs so that you don't have to order them all? Starting with you, Tad.
Oh, sorry, I thought we were starting with Colin. KNF is really popular. It stands for Korean Natural Farming. I am not an expert on it, but I've had the opportunity to talk to quite a few people that have experimented with it. I love the idea of sourcing things on your farm as much as possible. I think we do have to look at the fact that not all nutrients are found on all farms, and where we may need to bring in inputs, but there are things that are there that we can use. And for me, KNF is very similar to permaculture, which is something I'm a lot more familiar with. This idea of just creating sustainable systems or healthy ecosystems. And So I personally, like on our farm, for example, we try to recycle, so we look at the best use for every byproduct that we have. So, for example, with our leftover vegetables and things that don't get sold, when they start to rot, those go to the pigs, and then that pig manure then can be used as a nutrient source for some of our plants down the road. So we're looking at completing the cycle as much as possible with what we have available on the farm.
Jane?
Yeah, I mean, look, buying amendments year after year gets quite expensive, and it's difficult for people, and we've spent lots of money buying amendments, and so being able to use local things is very appealing. And so in our case, the extent that we've done that, we've grown cover crops and turned those into compost, tilled those in, and that has gotten us a lot of bang for our buck. We don't have animals at our farm, which I regret. It's just another thing to manage on a cannabis farm in Washington, and there's so much hassle and regulation that just adding animals to that picture would be unmanageable for us. But for people that can have animals on their farm, like he has pigs. I have friends who have chickens on their farms, and they go around and they let the chickens into the pot field, and they eat they poop, and they put fertilizer in, and they eat the weeds, and so there's a lot of things you can do with animals that are cheap, with chickens, and so I would love to do that someday. But we're not there yet.
I think about this as economies of scale and adding carbon back into the system. I'm just going to revisit this topic, and I really think you can use cover crops with precision and confidence if you understand them better. And you can see very marked results if you add a clover, which is a nitrogen fixer, where not only are you adding the carbon into the soil, but you're actually fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere and bringing that into the soil also. And you're going to see very different results between a Timothy grass or an alfalfa or a clover. And if you understand these cover crops more, you can engineer the soil fertility based on your farm. There's a lot of physical properties, the soil type, the water holding capacity, the climate that you're in, and so you're going to have to tailor those practices to your farm. I would use biochar in my home garden. I can't use it on my 65-acre hemp farm. It's not scalable, but I can grow clover on there, and so understanding how your field, how your farm responds, what your farm needs, you can really clearly identify the stoichiometry or nutrient ratios, nutrient expectations that different cover crops can bring in to supplement the soil health to meet the maximum productivity that you would like for your cannabis farm. Outdoors in particular is what we're talking about here. Thanks.
Cool, thanks, Colin. All right, so we're gonna open up to questions. Who's got a question to get us started? Right on.
So on that cover crop, we're an indoor garden, we have soil beds, and now if I was to use cover crops, because we have to amend our soil after our soil test every time, is it going to be harder to amend that soil with the cover crop on there to get it in the soil correctly?
Yeah. So I am going to have a caveat, and this is based on some experience. Not all practices work for every environment. I'm a big fan of cover crops, even on an indoor. I think that's interesting, but there's trade-offs with every decision that we make. And I'm going to add that we need to make sure we can measure that difference on a broad scale. If I add clover and grow it over 65 acres, I can really measure the difference over a couple of years in not only the carbon in the soil, but potentially the nitrogen levels as well. It's a cycling dynamic process, but over a couple of years, that's measurable. I'm not sure if an indoor pot system, if it's measurable in one cycle, and you want to have measurable results. And I also want to urge caution when you're implementing something like this into your system. I think it's a great idea, and I've had growers who tried to implement clover as an example in their indoor grow, and it turned out to be a vector for pests that made it harder for pest mitigation. And so there are trade-offs with every decision we make, and your environment might not be as suitable for a cover crop as an outdoor environment, and there's other solutions where we want to nurture the microbes, we want to nurture the carbon holding capacity, but maybe in your case, and you guys use Mammoth, adding that life, you see good results. Maybe adding some more carbon, you're going to see some good results. If you added clovers, maybe you're going to see good results. But if the clovers act as a vector to bring in more pests, maybe that's not the right solution as that example. So you really have to work through every scenario to find out what works best for you and then experiment with it.
Good, thank you.
Thanks, Colin. Peter, you want to hit it? Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to touch on that. So Colin brought up a really good point. One thing we have to remember with an indoor environment is we don't have that same diversity of beneficial insects naturally occurring like you would on an outdoor farm. And so I do think cover crops are a lot more challenging indoors. It's one more crop you do have to manage fairly stringently. That being said, I know people that are doing it successfully, even on a commercial level. If you want to check out Joshua Steensland or Freshwater Farms, that would be the example I'm closest to. But a lot of the guys I work with are choosing not to use cover crops for that reason, because it is a pest concern when you have just such a concentrated environment like that.
As a matter of fact, I just interviewed Joshua Steensland on indoor polyculture on my last episode at shapingfire.com. He goes in depth on using cover crops and a variety of plant species all through, but only in the indoor environment is his specialty. So we've got time for probably one more question. Who do we have? Great.
I've got a pretty loud voice. You mentioned that not all biochar is created equal. What would be a preferred type of biochar? Because we're seeing a lot of more people cold calling us at the farms, representing different types of biochar. And obviously I'm concerned. Anyone? Jane?
I have an opinion, and then Tad is more of an expert, but
Okay.
in academia, we looked at a whole bunch of different biochars and the actual surface area, the consistency, the variability over time. And just like what we're talking about in agriculture, consistent inputs equal consistent outputs. A consistent process, you get a consistent process. And if that yields a good product and it's consistent, you can rely on it. I think that what we find with a lot of these biochar manufacturing facilities is they're taking in inconsistent inputs and they're getting inconsistent outputs, and it's all over the place. And I'm speaking from the research that we conducted several years ago, and I know that there are facilities, manufacturing facilities that focus on predictable variability. There's always going to be a low variability, and I would ask those questions rigorously and look for the data to make sure that they can produce consistent product over a long period of time.
Is there any difference between, say, hardwoods, as you mentioned earlier, versus vegetable crops? Again, is it just consistency, or is there one medium that's better than other to have your biochar created from?
So many different kinds.
I know.
To add to this, there's just so many different kinds. I'm not going to discount the value of biochar. It's additional substrate and kind of an inert carbon, meaning it just has a lot of surface area and a habitat, which will allow nutrients to bind and microbes to create habitat. So you can conceptually get great value from a lot of different biochar sources. But if it's not consistent for your farm, you're going to have inconsistent results, and that's the big challenge in my opinion.
Thank you.
This could be a whole talk in and of itself, but I'll keep it really short. So when we're talking about biochar, we're talking about pyrolyzed materials, so very, very high heat, very, very low oxygen levels. And if you don't do that, what you end up with is charcoal. And one of the quick tests that Renelle over at Black Owl Biochar, that's who we've worked with for years, I have a good relationship with her. She said if you take your biochar and it floats, then it's not high quality biochar because it doesn't have the high absorption rates that you want. It's just a quick test, but you need to get all these test results. And I've heard of companies anecdotally using all types of materials because wood sourcing is tough. The Black Owl, I know they're using virgin forest slash, which sounds horrible, I realize, but it's actually a really good source because it needs to be dealt with, or it's a forest fire hazard. And by taking it and making it into biochar, they're able to sequester the carbon. And so there are good sources out there, but you really have to do due diligence on it. And I have seen research that showed good biochar made from anything from chicken manure to woods and all these different sources. It's really about the consistency of material and the quality of your inputs, like Colin alluded to.
Yeah, and just to add to that, one thing I have seen that is concerning, I've seen people making biochar out of waste wood from plywood and stuff that had adhesives and stuff in that. And that's something you would definitely stay away. If you hear anything about using any waste product from pre-processed wood. Just keep an eye out for that. That does happen. And then the other thing with biochar is you can make it yourself, and there are all kinds of instructions on the internet on how to build a reactor, and it's quite simple. It involves a 50-gallon metal drum, and you can produce a lot of biochar that way. And the people selling biochar sell it for like $1,000 for like a tote for 500 pounds or 1,000 pounds. It's incredibly expensive. It's like $1 a pound or something. And so adding any biochar, even if it's not like, if you make it yourself and it's not like the ideal conditioned biochar, the best particle size, it doesn't matter. You're putting carbon into your soil and sequestering it, and that's a good thing. And so if you can figure out how to make it yourself, like that is a really great way to go.
The last time I had a conversation with somebody about making biochar, we all realized that the margins were better than cannabis right now in Washington. So.
Oh, I think when I see I don't buy it anymore, when I see the price that people are selling it for, it's pretty alarming. So it's definitely something that you should try to make yourself if you feel at all crafty or capable. Definitely, highly recommend that.
Can I just add really quick, you want to charge it as well with, think of it like a giant sponge, so you need to fill it, and typically just a small amount of nitrogen is all you need. So in our soils, we added at a rate of 5 to 8%, so again, not a very high rate. That's a very aggressive rate for an agricultural soil. You use a lot less outdoor, but a small amount of nitrogen is what you really want to get on there. We soak ours in fish hydrolysate, I think at a rate of like an ounce per 10 gallons, so not very much. People can even use compost teas and things like that, but if you were to add it just straight biochar onto your soil, on your plant, it's actually going to be more efficient than your plant in a lot of cases of taking up nitrogen, so you can see your plant yellow and see deficiencies. So just be careful there with uncharged biochar.
Yeah, it'll suck the nutrients out of the soil if you put it in uncharged, and you'll be disappointed for at least a season.
Right on, fantastic. Well, thank you all for being here for the soil science presentation.